A low, unfamiliar quietness often forms the first contrast. Streets that appear almost unguarded, neighborhoods where late-night stillness carries no sense of alarm, and a public atmosphere shaped more by trust than vigilance create a kind of cultural dissonance for many Americans trying to make sense of Canada's approach to safety. The shift is not dramatic in appearance, yet it is profound in feeling. A country where the pace softens, where caution exists but does not dominate, where safety is not enforced loudly but nurtured quietly through social expectations and shared norms. What surprises many Americans is not the absence of risk, but the absence of constant alertness. The everyday hum of Canadian life unfolds in a way that feels steadier, more predictable, and less defined by the anticipation of danger. The first impressions often develop within hours. Public spaces tend to feel accessible and calm, whether in small towns or large cities. People move with an ease that reflects a certain societal confidence. Children walking to school without intense supervision, cyclists weaving through streets with minimal anxiety, and individuals leaving belongings on cafe tables without assuming they will disappear. Such details strike many visitors from the United States as unusual, not because they are extraordinary acts, but because they reveal a general faith in the environment. The emotional atmosphere leans toward a type of collective reassurance, a belief that most interactions will remain civil and that public order doesn't require constant defensive behavior. Even in busier urban areas, the presence of tension feels diluted compared to what many Americans are accustomed to navigating at home. As the contrast deepens, it reveals underlying cultural differences that rarely appear in tourist brochures. Canadian social behavior often gravitates toward moderation, risk aversion woven with courtesy, caution expressed without confrontation. The expectation is not merely to avoid harm, but to avoid causing discomfort. This shapes how conflict unfolds, how strangers interact, and how shared spaces are maintained. A slower pace of life reinforces these values, making impulsive reactions less common and public aggression less visible. The emotional climate is shaped by a wide regard for consensus, where most people internalize the idea that safety is a collective responsibility rather than an individual battle. Many Americans observing this dynamic notice the subtle but powerful distinction. In Canada, safety is not something individuals are constantly expected to secure for themselves. It is something society tries to uphold for everyone. Typical interactions reveal this in small but telling ways. People wait respectfully at crosswalks even when no cars are coming. Crowds tend to form orderly lines without prompting. Public disputes, when they do occur, unfold quietly, with measured tones rather than raised voices. The symbolism of these behaviors becomes clear over time. Safety is reinforced not through rigid enforcement, but through a mutual understanding of how to behave in ways that reduce friction. Transit systems provide another example. Passengers often step aside for others before boarding, creating a flow that feels cooperative rather than competitive. Even nightlife districts, which naturally bring unpredictability, tend to maintain an atmosphere of restraint rather than volatility. Over time, these observations take on a deeper dimension. Many Americans begin to notice how institutions subtly reinforce this cultural approach without relying on fear-based messaging. Safety guidelines tend to be phrased as collective suggestions rather than strict warnings. Public announcements carry a tone of reminder rather than command. Even law enforcement often operates with an emphasis on de-escalation, projecting calm instead of intimidation. This reinforces a national mindset that stability grows from predictability and mutual respect, not from constant readiness for conflict. The relationship between people and institutions reflects trust rather than suspicion, and that trust becomes part of the invisible architecture that shapes daily life. Certain symbolic situations highlight this contrast even more clearly. In many Canadian cities, late-night public transit remains busy with students, workers, and families who move through stations without the guarded posture that many Americans instinctively adopt in unfamiliar environments. Residential neighborhoods maintain low fences or none at all, signaling an assumption of community rather than intrusion. Joggers run through dimly lit parks not because danger is dismissed, but because the baseline expectation of social stability is stronger. These patterns are not perfect, nor are they universal. Yet they create a general environment where people behave as though safety is the norm rather than the exception. This atmosphere, in turn, shapes perspective. Many Americans find themselves recalibrating their sense of risk in ways that feel both strange and revealing. Constant vigilance begins to loosen, replaced by an awareness of how much mental energy had previously been spent scanning for threats. Some notice a shift in bodily rhythm, a slower heartbeat in crowded places, a steadier breathing pattern on public transport. The emotional bandwidth once tied to self-protection becomes available for observation, patience, or simple presence. This transformation does not erase the understanding of danger, but reframes it, suggesting that a society's collective behavior can influence personal psychology as powerfully as any formal safety measure. Broader worldview influenced by Canada's environment becomes evident in how people communicate. Conversations in public move at a measured pace, with interruptions kept minimal and disagreements approached with restraint. The absence of overt hostility contributes to a shared sense of predictability, a cultural assumption that most encounters will not escalate. Many Americans, observing this, begin to understand safety as something more layered than statistics. It becomes an emotional climate, an accumulated sense of orderliness, fairness, and trust that permeates daily life. Even small gestures, such as drivers slowing down near crosswalks long before a pedestrian steps forward, reinforce a quiet message. The collective is always factored into individual choices. Over a longer period, as the rhythms of daily life settle into familiarity, many Americans begin to recognize how this environment subtly alters their expectations of human behavior. In settings that might evoke tension elsewhere, crowded festivals, bus terminals during rush hour, or late-night streets after a snowfall, the dominant atmosphere remains measured. People move with a sense of shared spatial awareness, adjusting their paths without abruptness, rarely pushing past one another. The lack of volatility becomes not just a pleasant surprise, but a cultural signal that safety in Canada functions as a communal choreography, an unspoken agreement to maintain balance in public spaces. This shift often reshapes habits as well. Individuals who once carried themselves with heightened alertness find their steps slowing, their shoulders settling, their gaze lifting from constant scanning to simple observation. Many discover changes in how they interpret silence. Instead of treating it as a warning sign, they come to view it as a natural part of the emotional landscape. A quiet bus stop, a deserted trail, or an unguarded residential street no longer evokes concern but conveys the societal expectation that these spaces belong equally to everyone and are treated with corresponding care. This recalibration can feel profound, revealing how deeply culture informs the body's instinctive responses. Interactions follow a similar pattern. Small exchanges with strangers, brief acknowledgements, patient pauses, muted expressions of courtesy build an atmosphere where conflict rarely needs to emerge. Even the absence of certain behaviors becomes symbolic. Raised voices are uncommon, aggressive posturing stands out, and public tension dissipates quickly because bystanders rarely add fuel to it. These tendencies contribute to an emotional climate in which safety is upheld less through enforcement and more through collective restraint. It is a system that relies on assumptions of fairness, the predictability of social norms, and a widespread expectation that people will avoid causing disruption. In reflection, this cultural environment offers a wider insight into the nature of public safety itself. It demonstrates how the tone of a society shapes the behavior of its citizens and how behavior, in turn, reinforces the tone. Many Americans come to understand that safety in Canada is less about strict control and more about social equilibrium, a balance built from trust, moderation, and shared responsibility. This realization often lingers long after leaving, prompting a quiet awareness of how strongly a nation's emotional climate influences daily experience. It reveals that safety is not merely the absence of danger, but the presence of a collective mindset that allows people to move through the world with steadiness rather than fear.